Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Our guest today is a world-renowned expert in the lives and music of both Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. Dr. Kerry McCarthy is a careful scholar who loves the subjects she studies, and it comes across in how she conveys the import of the music of these composers, as well as the context in which the music emerged. We hope that this episode is interesting to choral directors, whether they are just learning about Byrd or if they've sung most of his graduale. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be involved with this.
We'd like to tap into your experience in English Renaissance choral music, firstly, by asking you to outline for us the basics of the political situation of Catholics in England following the separation of the Church in England from Rome in the 1530s.
The political situation of Catholics in 16th century England, that's a big question because it was kind of a moving target, really. It was always changing. Sometimes there were little changes, and once in a while there were these huge sudden changes. But there's one important political thing that happened really as soon as the Church of England separated from Rome in the 1530s. All of a sudden, there were a few million traitors in England. All of a sudden, there was a lot of treason. Because being loyal to the Pope, to the whole international body of the Catholic Church, all of a sudden was considered treason. Being a Catholic wasn't heresy or superstition or some sort of theological problem. It was high treason against the monarch because they were head of the church. And if you recognized the church as something bigger that existed outside England, then you were swearing allegiance to a foreign power. Well, that's why Thomas More was executed in the 1530s. He was executed as a traitor. So, of course, this put Catholics in a very uncomfortable, difficult situation for the whole rest of the century, even when they were being treated relatively nicely, not having their heads cut off. And of course, Byrd, living to the ripe old age of at least 80, didn't have his head cut off, but he had this underlying difficulty that he had to deal with.
So part of that political distancing from England, from the rest of Europe, largely, besides Germany, largely remaining Catholic, I guess one of the aspects of political control that the government in England was exercising was not only having the authority in the Church of England, but also changing the way in which England prays, right?
Absolutely.
Now England is going to be praying in a manner which is different from Catholic Europe. Can you describe the liturgical changes in the Church of England in the mid-16th century led by Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury?
Well, the Church of England at the very beginning, so under Henry VIII, was still basically very conservative because Henry liked it that way. It was really according to his personal whim. He loved long prayers in Latin. He liked fancy music. He liked large cathedrals and cloisters. In fact, he personally had a cloister built into Hampton Court Palace so he could have big processions. And this is while he was throwing monks and nuns out of their cloisters. So unless you were paying attention, really close attention during his reign, you wouldn't have noticed much change at all. Of course, he threw out the name of the Pope. He threw out some saints like Thomas à Becket, who were politically problematic. But the Reformation under Henry was really about power. He was in charge, and he had the church run according to his taste, which happened to be very conservative. Now, this kind of setup couldn't have lasted after his own death, and it didn't. A couple months after Henry was gone, stuff started to change. And within a couple of years, the services were completely in English. Archbishop Cranmer had figured out this Book of Common Prayer that was uniform. Everyone was required to use it. The daily round of services, of church services, was cut down quite a bit. So they were shorter, they were simpler, there weren't as many of them. And of course, the musical styles got a lot more straightforward, so you could hear the words more clearly. Now, there was something really a lot more fundamental behind all these changes. And I think this is what helps us think about what was really going on with church music during Byrd's lifetime. That was one of the big ideas of the Reformation, that the whole purpose of worship, the whole reason behind worship, is really supposed to be didactic. so that when you pray in church, you sing, you read, whatever, that you're doing it to teach people something. This idea that, even prayers that are said to God are ultimately exhorting the people who are there. They're teaching something to the people who are there. As soon as you have that little shift of focus, as soon as you decide that one of the main purposes of worship is to teach something rather than just gratuitously being there and worshiping God, because worship is really the most important thing people can do. As soon as you decide that, all kinds of changes start to happen. And of course, if you're a composer who writes church music, that changes your whole world completely. And that's the world that Byrd found himself dropped into when he started his career.
So this famous composer, William Byrd, to which we've been alluding already, and is the main subject of this episode, was the student of another famous English composer, Thomas Tallis. Could you tell us some of the essential historical elements of Byrd's biography and perhaps a bit about his studies with and relationship to his teacher, Tallis?
Yeah, so the composer we're talking about today, William Byrd, was born in the year 1540. So the same year that the very last monastery in England was closed down and dissolved. So these were changes that he reacted to, but he didn't necessarily live through them as a grown-up professional musician. Thomas Tallis was a whole generation older. We're not quite sure when he was born, but probably 30 or 40 years older. And he lived through these changes. In fact, Tallis was one of the musicians that very last monastery at Waltham Abbey. He was a lay musician who was hired to take care of the music. And when you look at the records of the dissolution, what you see is him being sent away. Bye-bye, Thomas, go do something else. So where he went is to Canterbury Cathedral, which had also been run by monks, and it was being drastically reorganized as a sort of showpiece for the new state church. So Canterbury Cathedral had the best possible music. It had really spectacular stuff, just the way Henry VIII wanted it. And then Henry died and things went really crazy. And Tallis lived through all of this. And it's reflected in the huge diversity of the music he published. Now, as far as Byrd goes, we're told by some, I think, fairly reliable sources that he was one of Tallis's students. We don't know exactly when that happened or even where it happened, but what's clear is that Byrd's music just owes so much to Tallis's music. Whether he's writing this virtuosic stuff for the keyboard or his service music in English or motets in Latin, just about anything else Byrd did, you can look back at Tallis's influence and say he was almost like a father to him in musical terms.
Do we know how Byrd came to be a part of the gentlemen of the choir of the Chapel Royal and any, say, difficulties with that as far as maintaining Catholic beliefs?
Well, the procedure with the Chapel Royal, as far as we know, was to hire the best possible people, and they tended to ask questions afterwards.
Like schools now, and if you play football,
absolutely,
depending where you want to go.
But even before Byrd joined the Chapel Royal, he would have had to consent to some sort of oath of royal supremacy. Even before that, when he was younger, he spent most of his 20s as the organist and the choir master at Lincoln Cathedral. And certainly anybody who worked in a major post at a cathedral like that would have had to swear to the monarch being the head of the church. And you think about this, your first serious job, you're maybe 21, 22 years old. They bring you in on the first day and you sign all kinds of papers. It's just a blur. You are so happy to have this employment and you don't necessarily think about it. I think these are issues that really became important for Byrd a little bit later, even after he started to be involved with the Royal Chapel. And in his case, you really have two separate sets of issues because there were two different pieces of legislation and really two different oaths that one was supposed to swear. One of the pieces of legislation is, I think, the one you asked me about earlier, the Act of Supremacy, which has to do with the monarch being head of the church. And the question there was, okay, how is the church governed? What does it really consist of? Who's in charge? That was the problem for Thomas More, for a lot of the earlier martyrs. The other act, the other legal document you had, was the Act of Uniformity. And the Act of Uniformity had to do with practical questions, how you worshipped, how you behaved, physically where you went to church and what you did on Sundays and feast days. And that, for Byrd and people who were involved with church music, was really the problem.
Could you tell us what the Pope had to say about those two different acts?
Well, the Pope's response to those two different acts was to excommunicate Queen Elizabeth in 1570, to say, well, if you're going to claim to be the head of the church and to exercise this kind of surveillance, really, on your subjects as to how they worship, I'm just going to excommunicate you, which maybe wasn't the best idea in retrospect, because that really escalated the situation a bit. But yes, it was not very friendly in mutual terms.
Well, and it also made clear the issue of conscience for Catholics who wanted to be loyal to the Pope.
Absolutely. They were, most Catholics in England were very patriotic. They had absolutely nothing against their country, nothing against the monarchy. And they were put in this completely unsustainable situation because they had to choose sides.
So what were some of the effects of Byrd's refusal in this regard, his recusancy? It's usually called recusancy. Perhaps you could also explain that term, on his financial situation and his career as time went on.
So recusancy, being a recusant, which is just another way of somebody who refuses, basically meant not going to the right church, refusing to go to Church of England services, instead going to Catholic services in private homes, to Puritan meetings, just refusing to go at all. The effects of this started out fairly mild at first, but they gradually got a lot more serious. So for a couple decades, really, after Elizabeth became queen, so we're talking now the 1560s and 70s, this is when Byrd started being active as a young professional musician, it seemed like there might be some kind of compromise that could work for Catholics and Protestants. But then around the beginning of the 1580s, so when Byrd was about 40 years old, stuff started escalating. Stuff started getting really, really difficult. For example, the Jesuits and some various other Catholic groups were sending missionaries to England, and they got caught and got executed in very nasty ways, most famously Edmund Campion in 1581. Now, these missionaries, the Jesuits and these guys, were peaceful. They were highly educated, intelligent, completely unarmed, just evangelizing. But there were also some Catholics who were a lot less peaceful. They thought they could fix everything by assassinating the queen, by having foreign armies invade England. And they were trying to make that happen in the 1580s. So there were a lot of violent reactions to all this. And one of the major reactions is that they changed the laws for dealing with recusants. So it used to be that being a recusant, not going to the right church, that was something dealt with by the ecclesiastical courts, by the church courts. So these are the courts that deal with complaints about people wearing the wrong vestments, that kind of thing, not with stuff like treason. And there were fines for being a recusant, but they'd been relatively small, maybe the equivalent of $20 a week. So losing that money, sure, it's going to make your life more difficult, but it probably won't ruin your entire household. That all changed in the 1580s. Now being a recusant was a civil offense, and it was dealt with by the civil courts. It was a real crime. That meant that Byrd was a criminal, and that meant there was really nowhere to hide. So that's the point you start to see Byrd's life really changing because of this. We have a few documents that really outline this. One of them is actually from one of the Jesuits. He's writing about Byrd in this letter, and he calls him a very celebrated English organist. And he says, who'd been formerly in the Queen's Chapel, but for his religion, he sacrificed everything. Now, of course, this Jesuit may have had an axe to grind, but there's really no reason to think he was lying about Byrd's situation, about being a former member of the chapel at this point. And there's, in fact, another document, it's just a legal document, that calls him Mr. Byrd, sometime of Her Majesty's Chapel, which that could mean on again, off again. But the obvious meaning is just a former member. He used to work full-time for the Queen, and now he doesn't. And there's another document that shows he was under a sort of house arrest for a while. They were clearly keeping tabs on him. And then there's something that's so obvious that it was right in front of my face. I was studying Byrd for at least 15 or 20 years before I even noticed it. And that's the fact that if Byrd was still working full-time for the Queen, if he was still working full-time with the Chapel Royal, there is no way on earth he could have been persecuted as a recusant. because he would have been constantly attending the most Anglican services on the whole planet, right across the room from the head of the whole Church of England. So he was clearly breaking away, or at least being pushed away into something else.
What was that something else after his career in the Chapel Royal?
Well, after this turning point, where we find him is living out in the country in Essex. So he moved his whole family, 30 miles away from London. His main patrons now are Catholic gentry, are these Catholic aristocrats who have private household chapels, and he started writing masses for them. And as far as we can tell, he really only came back to the Chapel Royal for a few really important events. I'm talking about huge stuff like Elizabeth's funeral in 1603. And what he did do, and this was very clever on his part, was to collect his salary from the chapel every single month for the rest of his life. And I actually suspect they were kind of happy to pay his salary. So it's a win-win situation. They get the prestige of having Mr. Byrd on their staff, this famous composer, but they didn't actually have to deal with him. And the whole Catholic thing was more or less an open secret. The British are very good at open secrets. That sort of thing. They still do that very well.
Can you comment on the differences between Byrd's music, perhaps in style, from when he was in the Chapel Royal versus when he moved to the country and had Catholic patrons?
So Byrd was writing a lot of Latin motets, even as a young man, even when he was very much involved with the Anglican establishment. But these pieces, these big Latin pieces, weren't really liturgical in any meaningful sense. They weren't being written for church services. They weren't being written for singing in church at all. They were a sort of sophisticated chamber music in a kind of international style. If you were a composer in the Renaissance and you wanted to write really high quality stuff that had a sort of international cachet, just like in the 19th century, you might write string quartets or symphonies. In the 16th century, you wrote motets in Latin. They worked in any country, any language. Latin is universal. They were okay with pretty much any ideology, unless you were the extreme sort of Swiss Protestant who thought that absolutely all music should be taboo. You're going to be okay with educated people sitting around the table singing this stuff. And some of these early motets by Byrd are very complex, very sophisticated. In fact, his first publication was a big book of motets just like this that he shared with Tallis. Each of them published 17 pieces. And they actually dedicated the book to the Queen, to Queen Elizabeth. So clearly there wasn't any political problem with writing motets like this. But then when you look at his later stuff, the stuff that he wrote for use in real Catholic services, the one thing I notice most is that it's a lot less ostentatious. It's a lot smaller in general. Some of these older motets, they're for 8 or 9 voices. They go on for 10 minutes. But the real liturgical music is just a lot more modest. If any of you have sung Byrd's 3-part Mass, think about the Kyrie. That is the shortest Kyrie known to man. maybe 30 seconds if you take pauses in between the invocations. But it's a completely different approach, certainly from a lot of the English pre-Reformation composers who could easily make a single Mass movement go on for 10, 12 minutes. All of a sudden you had this sort of economy, this sort of sobriety almost. And I'm thinking actually of the theme music for this podcast. I listened to some episodes of it. You had this wonderful setting of Haec Dies by Byrd that you start out with. Mm-hmm. That was one of his earlier works, one of his big motets. And he came back 20 years later and he set that same text as the Easter graduale as part of a set of Mass propers. And it's completely different. It's a lot more subdued. It's not really performing the joy of Easter with, fireworks and all. It's a lot simpler and it just fits very nicely into its place. So he's really changed his whole aesthetic. It's not that the music isn't beautiful or joyful. It's just a lot less extrovert.
So speaking of this specifically liturgical music, can you tell us about the gradualia written by Byrd? And what this book is, what that term means. What's the structure of the collection of compositions in that book? That is, what sorts of pieces do they include? How is it related to the liturgical year?
Absolutely. So the Gradualia, published by Byrd in 2 books in 1605 and 1607, so quite late in his life, is this huge collection of music for various feast days and various holidays of the church year. And the name Gradualia It comes from the same word as the chant book that some of you might be familiar with, called the graduale. That's the big book with all the changeable parts of the Mass that you sing on different days. So Byrd's collection has 109 pieces altogether. There's a lot of music in there. And the core of the whole thing is a complete set of Mass propers for 12 big feasts of the year. So you have Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas. You have that whole little cycle. Then in the spring, you have Annunciation, March 25th. You've got Easter, of course. You wouldn't miss that. Ascension, Pentecost, Corpus Christi. And then in June, Peter and Paul. In August, the Assumption of the Virgin. September, the Nativity of the Virgin. And then the last one is All Saints. So these are really the big ancient feast days. The one exception is Corpus Christi, which was stuck in fairly late. In fact, if you look at the Eastern Orthodox calendar, they have what they call their 12 great feasts, and it's almost the same list. These are really, really the important ancient feasts. Now, the music of these Mass settings, it's a little bit ironic to be talking about Byrd on the Square Notes podcast, because there really are almost no square notes involved in the making of this stuff. These pieces are not based on chant melodies. In fact, the interesting thing is that Byrd tried a couple times composing some of this around a chant melody, and then he stopped. The one obvious example, the Christmas introit, he gets about that far in the Cantus Firmus and just, nope, I'm not going to do that. He just stops. And in fact, the way he arranges these Mass propers are by mode. Every feast day is in its own mode. All Saints' Day is in F major. Easter is in D minor, to be a little anachronistic about it. The Feast of St. Peter and Paul is in C major. These are big pieces for six voices. In fact, the apostles get the only six-voice day of the whole year. It's this kind of grand and pompous C major. It's got a bit of the Meistersinger overture feel to it. But he chooses a single mode for each day, which is the complete opposite of what you get if you sing the Gregorian chant propers. For Easter example, the Easter introit is based on E, the communion is based on F. You have this diverse bunch of melodies with all kinds of different arrangements. But Byrd does something different. He takes each day and he unifies it around an individual tonal center, which makes each set of music very satisfying to sing. And it also gives each day a very, very distinctive flavor.
I think it's fairly safe to say that the most popular work of William Byrd is his striking setting of the Ave Verum Corpus. Could you talk about what makes this piece so hauntingly beautiful, and perhaps also put the context of this piece, where does this fit in Byrd's life? Is this when he's in Sussex? Is this earlier?
The reason Ave Verum Corpus is so popular is probably because it's one of the very, very few pieces by Byrd, especially one of the very few Latin texted pieces, that really fits a standard four-part choir, a standard four-part soprano, alto, tenor, bass arrangement, like you see in most modern church choirs. But another wonderful thing about that piece is just its directness. Very expressive with the text, very clear. You can almost understand the words without seeing them written down in a program. And the interesting thing about this is that the style of this particular piece, it was published in the Gradualia. It was actually published along with the Corpus Christi music, along with some assorted stuff for the Blessed Sacrament, some processional music and things. But it doesn't have that much in common with most of his other Latin works. Really, the style that he's borrowing is almost more from the English music that he wrote for the court chapel. This very direct, almost didactic, setting out the text, note by note, word by word, very rhetorical. And I think that kind of directness is really, really attractive to people. And just also the fact that it's a lot easier to sing than some of the Mass propers, which are, even for professionals, can make you break out in a bit of a sweat when you're sight reading it. Yeah. No, it's a great piece. And I encourage every choir to sing Ave Verum.
Yeah, it's so beautiful, and it's so accessible, which I think is why it's done so much in church choirs.
Absolutely, I think that's the piece that he wrote for every man.
Right.
This is so much fun. These are such great questions.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear so much about, because I don't know. I've sung quite a bit of Byrd's music, but to hear the perspective of where it fits in, the context in which he's writing it, it's fascinating. I didn't realize the simplicity more of when he was in the Chapel Royal versus. So he went back to a more elaborate style for when he was writing the Catholic music and when he was retired. Is that right?
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of the Anglican music he was writing in English was very, very straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was young, he wrote a lot of very complicated music with Latin texts.
Right, which was
basically showing off.
Right, and it wasn't that often the kind of the musical tradition pre-Reformation, of the Eton choir book, what showing off vocal virtuosity and melismas
Yes.
for days.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you get the feeling he was plugging back into that, but then with these later works, it's like he's reconciling the two somehow. He says, yes, you can have this rich tradition, and you can also have this kind of directness. And certainly at some of the best moments in his masses, it just hits you in the face with the text, with this very, very clear rhetoric. And in a way, it's really the best of both worlds.
Right, when you can use both styles to contrast each other.
Because he was just in such a unique place, having experience with both things.
So this other very famous group of compositions by Byrd are something you've just referred to, his masses for 3 voices, 4 voices, or 5 voices, especially because they work so well when sung 1 to a part or in a small setting. So, for example, especially here in the New York region, everyone is always singing the Byrd masses for 3, 4, or 5. What do you think makes these works so attractive and well suited for the voice from perhaps a technical standpoint?
Well, to start with, Byrd's masses are kind of an unusual group because they're such a small group. Byrd only wrote 3 masses. Now, Palestrina wrote more like 103. And it certainly wasn't because of writer's block. We know that Byrd was very prolific, unlike Tallis, who seems to have agonized a lot about the details of his compositions. Byrd seems not to have had any trouble cranking it out when he had to. But the fact that he only wrote these 3 very specific masses, 1 for each combination of voices, and the fact that really, unlike almost every other Renaissance composer, he didn't base them on any outside material. They weren't what you might call parody masses, where he took a motet or a song or some sort of tune and built a mass around them. They were all composed from scratch, and they were almost sort of platonic forms, the sort of perfect forms of here's the best possible mass I can write for 3 voices. Or here's the best possible mass I can write for 4 voices. And there's this kind of rightness about them that you notice when you sing them. Now, you said, I think, well suited for the voice. They're not particularly easy to sing. In fact, I think anyone who thinks they're easy to sing either has Stockholm syndrome or that they've just rehearsed them a lot. The vocal ranges are not particularly standard. They're in something like the 4-part mass, they're extremely wide. The inner parts cover almost 2 octaves.
Right.
And this is really something different from the standard Anglican cathedral music that Byrd was writing earlier in life, where everything was very standardized. If you sing alto, you have a specific range that you're expected to sing, and any singer is kind of interchangeable with any other singer. The sense I get for the masses is that Byrd was writing them for very specific groups of people, and he had very specific voices in mind. And they weren't just these kind of itinerant professionals who'd come into some cathedral and get paid their 20 shillings or whatever and sing the service for the day. This was a particular person who lived in this particular household and worshiped with this particular group of people, and this was their vocal range. And in fact, most of the people who sang in these Catholic households tended to be very good amateurs. The professional singers were elsewhere making their livings. And in my experience, you can get really good amateur singers to do things that professionals would cringe at or just really refuse to do. What do you mean 2 octaves? That's not, that's not a proper range. But there's this extraordinary kind of freedom with these voices, and it's a lot of fun to sing. I certainly wouldn't say easy, but the other thing about these masses is actually something that Byrd said in the introduction, the preface to one of his publications. He was talking about his own music, and what he said is essentially the more often you sing it, the better you'll like it, the better it'll get. And that would be a really arrogant thing to say about your own music. if it weren't true. And the more often you sing it, I think he said the greater cause of liking you'll find. But that's the extraordinary thing about these masses. As a church musician, I've probably sung his 3 masses at least 100 times. And every time you sing them, you notice something new. And every time you sing them, you find something to love even more. And even the greatest masses of other Renaissance composers, they seem not to have quite that level of richness and discovery. Some pieces by Josquin, you can dig in that deep, but it's rare. It's rare. It's extraordinary.
That's a true mark of beauty, right? Beauty in the liturgical context is something that bears repetition well, distinctly.
Absolutely. It's inexhaustible. It really is.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really clear and helpful discussion outlining both the really interesting aspects of Byrd's life as a Catholic in a persecuted context and understanding how his faith related to his music and the sacred liturgy.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Where might listeners read more about your scholarship on William Byrd?
Well, gosh, I recently published a book with Oxford University Press. The title of the book is just Byrd, and it's basically a biography and also talks about his musical works and has a few chapters that are really specifically dedicated to the Latin texted stuff, the church music, the liturgical music. There are a lot of wonderful articles out there written by various people. If you have access to JSTOR, I would say just put William Byrd in there and prepare to be amazed. And above all, in the last 15 or 20 years, there have been so many wonderful recordings. And a lot of those recordings have great program notes. If you go in and look at the liner notes, some of the best people in the world are really doing some of the best scholarship with these performing groups. And you can read what they have to say there. I'd say, yeah, if you want to know more about Byrd, the best thing to do is to start listening.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've put links to Dr. McCarthy's books on Byrd in our show notes page, and we urge you to likewise check out her forthcoming book on Tallis. In the meantime, if you're interested in beefing up your choral directing skills, check out a class we're offering this summer through St. Joseph's Seminary entitled Conducting and Group Vocal Pedagogy for the Parish Music Director. It's taught by Dr. Timothy McDonnell, the head of the Sacred Music Area and Director of Choral Studies at Catholic University of America. You can find more information about the course, how to register, and how to get a 50% discount on tuition on our website, www.sacredmusicpodcast.com. Click on Upcoming Events. Our next episode dives into the visual arts and their intersection with music in the realm of illuminated manuscripts. Be sure to check it out when it's released next week. And until then, may we sing the praise of his glory.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.